My girlfriend's ex showed up at our wedding with a shocking confession. I stood at the altar, my hands clammy despite the cool autumn breeze drifting through the open-air venue. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Sarah, my soulmate, was about to walk down the aisle, and in just a few minutes we'd be bound together forever. Everything was perfect, until he showed up. The crowd stirred, whispers rising like a storm rolling in. I turned to see a man at the back of the seating area, dressed in a dark suit. He had this desperate, almost haunted look in his eyes. I knew who he was instantly. Jake, Sarah's ex. The same Jake she hadn't spoken to in years. The same Jake she told me she was completely over. Heart pounding, I shot a glance at my best man, Mark, who gave me a look that screamed, "Do you want me to handle this?" But before I could say anything, Jake stepped forward. "Sarah, wait!" His voice cut through the ceremony like a knife. Sarah, who had just stepped onto the aisle with her father, froze. The color drained from her face. The guests turned in their seats, murmuring. I clenched my jaw, barely restraining the anger bubbling inside me. What the hell was he doing here? The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly, and Sarah's father gave her a questioning look. But before anyone could stop him, Jake walked straight to the front, locking eyes with Sarah. "I know I have no right to be here," he said, voice trembling. "But I couldn't let this happen without telling you the truth." I crossed my arms, every muscle in my body tensed. "What truth?" I demanded. Jake hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Sarah, I never cheated on you." My stomach twisted. That was the reason Sarah had given me for their breakup. She told me she caught him texting another woman late at night, that he was emotionally unfaithful, and that it broke her heart. She swore she could never trust him again. That was why she moved on. That was why we were here. Sarah's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. Jake exhaled sharply. "You were set up." A hushed silence fell over the guests. Sarah shook her head, confusion flickering across her face. "Set up? By who?" Jake hesitated, then dropped the bombshell. "By your mother." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. My own breath hitched. "What?" Sarah visibly swayed, and I reached for her, steadying her. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head. "Why would my mother—" "She hated me," Jake said, his voice pained. "She told me flat out that she didn't think I was good enough for you, that I didn't have the right job, the right connections. I didn't fit into the life she wanted for you, and when I wouldn't break up with you, she made sure you'd do it instead." Sarah looked like she was going to be sick. Jake pulled out his phone and held up the screen. "She paid a woman to send those messages to my phone. Look, I have the proof. I only found out a week ago, but I had to tell you before you married someone else under false pretenses." I swallowed hard, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. Was this real? Sarah's mother sat stiffly in the front row, her face pale but unreadable. Sarah turned to her, voice shaking. "Mom, tell me this isn't true." Her mother looked away, and that's when I knew. Sarah's face crumpled, tears filling her eyes. Oh my God. I felt the ground shift beneath me. This was our wedding day. And yet, it suddenly felt like everything we had built was cracking apart. She turned to me, eyes pleading. "Ethan, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." I searched her face, my mind racing. Did this change anything? Did it matter? Did she still love Jake? Jake looked between us, his jaw tight. "I just had to tell you," he said quietly. "I'm not here to ruin your wedding. I just couldn't let you marry him thinking I was the villain." With that, he turned and walked away. The silence was deafening. Sarah's mother wouldn't even meet her gaze. And I stood there waiting for her to make a choice. Would she still say I do? Or had everything changed? Sarah stood frozen, her bouquet trembling in her hands. The weight of the revelation hung over us like a storm cloud, suffocating and inescapable. The guests sat in stunned silence, waiting, no, watching, to see what would happen next. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. My fiancé's ex had just revealed that everything we knew about their breakup was a lie, orchestrated by the woman sitting in the front row. Her mother. Sarah turned toward her mother, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did this?" Her mother finally looked up, her face composed but tight with something that looked like regret. "I did what I had to do," she said stiffly. Sarah's breath hitched. "Had to? You destroyed my relationship. You lied to me." Her mother sighed, shaking her head. "Jake wasn't good enough for you, sweetheart. I knew you'd waste years on him, and he had nothing to offer you. Look at where you are now. Look at him." She gestured toward me. "Ethan is stable, responsible. He's the kind of man who can give you a future. I did what was best for you." I flinched at that. The worst part? I could see Sarah's mother believed what she was saying. Sarah looked shattered. Her hands curled into fists, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. She turned to me next, and my stomach twisted at the desperation in her gaze. "Ethan, say something." I swallowed, my mind spinning. I loved Sarah. I wanted to spend my life with her. But right now, I didn't know if I was just the safe option her mother had forced her into. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice tight. Sarah's face fell. A deep, uneasy silence followed. Then she did something I didn't expect. She stepped back, away from the altar, away from me. The breath caught in my throat. "Sarah," I said, reaching for her, but she shook her head. I need a second." She turned to the officiant, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this. Not like this." The guests gasped. My stomach dropped. She wasn't saying she didn't love me. She wasn't saying she wanted Jake back. But she was saying she couldn't go through with the wedding. Not right now. Sarah turned to me again, her eyes pleading. "Ethan, I love you. But this is huge. I need time to process it." My mouth went dry. The woman I was about to marry was calling off the wedding. The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly. "So, should we, pause?" A few people in the crowd laughed nervously, but no one spoke. Sarah turned to our guests. "I'm so sorry, everyone. I didn't plan for this to happen." I clenched my fists. I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that we could move past this, that we could fix it. But I also knew she was right. This wasn't just about me. It was about everything. Her mother's betrayal, the truth about her past, the possibility that if things had been different, maybe she and Jake would still be together. I exhaled sharply, looking at her. "Do you still love him?" Her breath hitched. I don't know." That was all I needed to hear. I nodded slowly, taking a step back. "Then I think we both know what we need to do." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Ethan." And just like that, the wedding was over. The guests stood in awkward silence as I walked away, my heart shattering with every step. Sarah wasn't the only one who needed time. I did too. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the ending either of us expected. And I wasn't sure if this was goodbye, or just a pause in our story. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. I sat at an outdoor cafe, my fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at nothing in particular. A year had passed since that disastrous wedding day. A year since Sarah and I had walked away from the altar, both of us shattered and uncertain. I won't lie, those first few months were rough. We tried to talk a few times, but every conversation was weighted down by too many unanswered questions. Eventually, we stopped reaching out. Sarah needed space, and I needed clarity. So I focused on myself. I traveled, spent more time with friends, poured my energy into work. I had to figure out who I was without Sarah. I thought I'd moved on. I really did. Until today. Because today, Sarah was sitting across the cafe from me, unaware that I was here. She looked different, lighter, happier. Her hair was longer, and she wore a simple white sundress, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the table as she read something on her phone. I hesitated. Should I say something? Walk away? Before I could decide, she looked up. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, she smiled. And just like that, everything came rushing back. I took a deep breath, stood, and walked over to her table. Hey, stranger. Her lips parted slightly in surprise. Then a quiet laugh. Hey! I gestured to the empty chair. Mind if I sit? She nodded, her gaze searching mine. Please. As I sat down, an old familiar warmth settled between us. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. My fiancé's ex had just revealed that everything we knew about their breakup was a lie, orchestrated by the woman sitting in the front row. Her mother. Sarah turned toward her mother, her voice barely above a whisper. You did this? Her mother finally looked up, her face composed but tight with something that looked like regret. I did what I had to do, she said stiffly. Sarah's breath hitched. Had to? You destroyed my relationship. You lied to me. Her mother sighed, shaking her head. Jake wasn't good enough for you, sweetheart. I knew you'd waste years on him, and he had nothing to offer you. Look at where you are now. Look at him. She gestured toward me. Ethan is stable, responsible. He's the kind of man who can give you a future. I did what was best for you. I flinched at that. The worst part? I could see Sarah's mother believed what she was saying. Sarah looked shattered. Her hands curled into fists, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. She turned to me next, and my stomach twisted at the desperation in her gaze. Ethan, say something. I swallowed, my mind spinning. I loved Sarah. I wanted to spend my life with her. But right now, I didn't know if I was just the safe option her mother had forced her into. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice tight. Sarah's face fell. A deep, uneasy silence followed. Then she did something I didn't expect. She stepped back, away from the altar, away from me. The breath caught in my throat. Sarah, I said, reaching for her, but she shook her head. I need a second. She turned to the officiant, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this. Not like this. The guests gasped. My stomach dropped. She wasn't saying she didn't love me. She wasn't saying she wanted Jake back. But she was saying she couldn't go through with the wedding. Not right now. Sarah turned to me again, her eyes pleading. Ethan, I love you. But this is huge. I need time to process it. My mouth went dry. The woman I was about to marry was calling off the wedding. The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly. So, should we, pause? A few people in the crowd laughed nervously, but no one spoke. Sarah turned to our guests. I'm so sorry, everyone. I didn't plan for this to happen. I clenched my fists. I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that we could move past this, that we could fix it. But I also knew she was right. This wasn't just about me. It was about everything. Her mother's betrayal, the truth about her past, the possibility that if things had been different, maybe she and Jake would still be together. I exhaled sharply, looking at her. Do you still love him? Her breath hitched. I don't know. That was all I needed to hear. I nodded slowly, taking a step back. Then I think we both know what we need to do. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, Ethan. And just like that, the wedding was over. The guests stood in awkward silence as I walked away, my heart shattering with every step. Sarah wasn't the only one who needed time. I did too. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the ending either of us expected. And I wasn't sure if this was goodbye, or just a pause in our story. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. I sat at an outdoor cafe, my fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at nothing in particular. A year had passed since that disastrous wedding day. A year since Sarah and I had walked away from the altar, both of us shattered and uncertain. I won't lie, those first few months were rough. We tried to talk a few times, but every conversation was weighted down by too many unanswered questions. Eventually, we stopped reaching out. Sarah needed space, and I needed clarity. So I focused on myself. I traveled, spent more time with friends, poured my energy into work. I had to figure out who I was without Sarah. I thought I'd moved on. I really did. Until today. Because today, Sarah was sitting across the cafe from me, unaware that I was here. She looked different. Lighter. Happier. Her hair was longer, and she wore a simple white sundress, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the table as she read something on her phone. I hesitated. Should I say something? Walk away? Before I could decide, she looked up. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, she smiled. And just like that, everything came rushing back. I took a deep breath, stood, and walked over to her table. Hey, stranger. Her lips parted slightly in surprise. Then a quiet laugh. Hey. I gestured to the empty chair. Mind if I sit? She nodded, her gaze searching mine. Please. As I sat down, an old familiar warmth settled between us. I didn't expect to see you here, she admitted, stirring her drink. Yeah, me neither, I said honestly. But maybe it's fate. She smiled, a little wistful. Maybe. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our past lingering between us. Then she sighed. Ethan, I want to say that I'm sorry. Not just for what happened at the wedding, but for everything. For not seeing the truth sooner. For hurting you. I studied her, my heart pounding. Do you regret it? Her eyes softened. I regret the pain it caused, but I don't regret taking the time to figure out who I am. I nodded, understanding completely. So, did you ever talk to Jake again? I asked, bracing myself. She shook her head. Number he was part of my past, and I realized that's where he needed to stay. That chapter is closed. I exhaled, relief washing over me. She hesitated. And you? Are you seeing anyone? I smirked. Nope, still single, still figuring things out. She laughed softly. Same. Another pause. A long, meaningful one. Finally, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. Ethan, would you ever consider starting over? I looked into her eyes, the same ones I fell in love with all those years ago. And I realized something. Despite everything, despite the pain, the unanswered questions, the time apart, I still loved her. I smiled, lacing my fingers with hers. Yeah, I murmured. I think I would. And just like that, our story began again. The following months were a blur of rebuilding. Neither of us rushed into anything, and that was exactly what we both needed. We started with simple things. Coffee dates, long walks in the park, quiet dinners where we'd talk, laugh, and slowly chip away at the walls we'd built between us. It was clear there was still a deep connection, but it wasn't the same as before. We weren't jumping back into a whirlwind romance. We were building something new, something stronger. At first, Sarah's mom stayed out of the picture, and I had to admit, part of me was relieved. Her betrayal weighed heavy on both of us, and it would take time to process everything that had happened. But gradually, Sarah began reaching out to her mom again. One chilly Saturday morning, Sarah and I sat in a cozy cafe, sipping lattes, when she looked up at me, her face serious. I want to see my mom. I think it's time. I raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? I'm sure, she said, her voice firm but uncertain. I have a lot to say to her, but I want you to come with me. I nodded. I knew this wasn't going to be easy for her, or for me, but I respected her decision. Later that afternoon, we pulled up to her mom's house. The white walls of the home looked almost too pristine against the overcast sky. My chest tightened as Sarah opened the car door, but I didn't stop her. I was here to support her, no matter what. Her mom greeted us at the door, her eyes wary but unreadable. There was an awkward silence before she stepped aside, letting us in. "I'm sorry, Mom," Sarah said quietly after we'd taken a seat. "I don't know where to start." Her mom didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, staring at her hands in her lap before looking up at Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry too, honey. I was wrong. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I knew what was best for you, but I didn't. I hurt you, and I ruined your chance at happiness with someone who loved you." The tension in the room thickened, but Sarah's gaze softened. "You did ruin it. You made me believe Jake was bad for me when he wasn't. You manipulated me, and I let you." Her mom nodded slowly, her voice breaking. "I was scared. I saw what you had with him, and I didn't think he was good enough for you. But I was wrong. I see that now." There was a long pause, and then Sarah spoke again. "I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I used to, but I want to try. For both of us." I watched them, my heart heavy. It was clear that this was going to be a slow, painful process. But it was also a start. Maybe not for a perfect relationship, but for something that could heal over time. After that meeting, things didn't magically get better. There were more difficult conversations, more moments of silence, and the occasional misunderstanding. But little by little, the walls came down. And more importantly, Sarah and I began to rebuild our relationship on a new foundation. One that was honest, raw, and filled with the understanding that love doesn't always come easy. We spent more time together, learning about each other again. We didn't rush, didn't try to force things back to how they were. Instead, we enjoyed the small moments, the quiet evenings at home, the laughter that would bubble up unexpectedly, the way she'd hold my hand like she didn't want to let go. One day, several months later, I found myself walking beside her through a park. The sun was setting, painting the sky with pinks and oranges. It was the same park where we had walked many times before, but it felt different now. We weren't just trying again. We were new, different, stronger. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft. "I know things are different now, and maybe that's for the best. I've learned so much in the last year. About myself. About you, about love." I smiled. "Me too." She stopped walking and turned to face me. I think I'm ready to start over. For real this time." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Her eyes locked onto mine, her smile growing wider. "I mean, I want us to really start over. No more secrets, no more doubts, just us. What do you say?" I took a deep breath, taking her hands in mine. I say, "I'm all in." And that was it. We'd rebuilt what we'd lost, not by going back to the past, but by moving forward together. Our love story had been complicated, messy, and full of obstacles. But it was also real. And it was ours. And this time, we were ready to write the next chapter. Together. We'd come a long way in the past year. Sarah and I had found our way back to each other, but we weren't the same people we had been before. We were stronger, more honest, and, perhaps most importantly, more in tune with what we both wanted. The storm of our past had passed, and now we could finally look ahead with hope. After that day in the park, everything felt different. Every moment together was like a chance to rediscover one another. But there was still one thing left that we hadn't fully addressed. The wedding. The one that had been interrupted. The day that had started with so much promise and ended in heartbreak. Sarah and I talked about it. A lot. "I never wanted to walk away from you that day," she confessed one evening as we sat on the couch, our hands intertwined. "I wanted you, Ethan. I was just lost. It was too much. Too fast." I nodded, understanding. "I get it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that day, about what happened, and I think maybe it wasn't just the wedding that we weren't ready for. It was everything we hadn't dealt with yet. Her eyes softened and she rested her head on my shoulder. I've spent so much of my life listening to everyone else, trying to make everyone happy, that I didn't really think about what would make me happy. I squeezed her hand. And now you're figuring it out. We both are. It was true. We were no longer trying to meet expectations. Our love had become something raw and real, a journey that was ours and ours alone. One afternoon, as we were out walking in the city, I stopped in front of a small jewelry store. The window displayed a set of engagement rings, each one more beautiful than the last. Without thinking, I took Sarah's hand and led her inside. The soft chime of the bell above the door announced our arrival. The saleswoman smiled warmly, and I felt Sarah's gaze shift to the rings on display. I glanced at her, a bit nervous, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I had to ask the question that had been burning inside me for months. "Sarah," I began, my voice steady but my heart racing. "I know we've been through a lot. And maybe things aren't perfect, but I'm certain about one thing." I paused, looking deep into her eyes. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you." She blinked, her lips parting as if she were caught off guard. "Ethan, what are you saying?" "I'm asking you to marry me again," I said, taking a deep breath. "Not because of some perfect wedding or because it's expected, but because I've realized that no matter what happens, you're the person I want to be with." Her face softened, tears brimming in her eyes. "You really mean that?" "I do." The world around us seemed to fade away as Sarah's lips trembled into a smile. "I can't believe you're asking me this after everything we've been through. But yes, Ethan. Yes." She threw her arms around me and I held her tight, feeling the weight of our past, present, and future collide in the most beautiful way. Planning the wedding this time felt different. We weren't rushing. We weren't trying to create some fairy tale. This time we were building something that reflected who we truly were, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who had supported us along the way. It was a quiet, intimate ceremony in the same venue where we'd almost gotten married a year before. This time, there was no interference, no drama, just the people who mattered most. My family, her mom included after much healing, and a handful of close friends who had been there through it all. It wasn't grand, but it was perfect. As Sarah walked down the aisle, I felt like everything had come full circle. She was glowing, radiant, her smile wide and genuine. And I couldn't help but feel grateful for the journey that had brought us here. When it was time for our vows, I took her hands in mine and looked into her eyes. "Sarah, I know we've had our challenges, but I wouldn't change any of it. Because those moments brought us to where we are now. Together. You've shown me what real love is, and I promise to always choose you. Through the good, the bad, and everything in between." She smiled through her tears, squeezing my hands. "Ethan, I promise to always be honest with you. To never let fear or doubt stand in the way of us. I will love you through the hard times and the easy times, because you are my home." I couldn't hold back the tears either. We'd both come a long way. And standing there, surrounded by those we loved, I knew this was only the beginning of our forever. We kissed, and the cheers that followed felt like the culmination of everything we'd fought for. The honeymoon was simple. Just the two of us. A quiet cabin by the lake where we spent days hiking and nights talking, rediscovering each other in the most peaceful way possible. No distractions, no expectations, just us. As we sat on the porch one evening, watching the stars, Sarah leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder. "You know, this feels perfect," she murmured. "This is what I always wanted. A real life with you." I kissed the top of her head. "This is just the beginning. We've got a lifetime of adventures ahead." She smiled, a slow, contented smile that made my heart swell. And I realized in that moment that no matter what challenges came our way, we had already won. We had each other, and that was enough. The first few months of married life felt like a dream. The honeymoon glow hadn't quite worn off, and Sarah and I spent our days basking in the calm of simply being together. But life, as always, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah and I decided to spend the day at a local art exhibit, something we'd both been looking forward to. It was one of those events that felt like an escape from the routine, an opportunity to spark creativity. As we walked through the gallery, admiring the abstract paintings and sculptures, I couldn't help but notice Sarah was unusually quiet. I glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "You okay?" She gave me a half smile, but her eyes seemed distant. "Yeah, just thinking." "About?" She shrugged. "You know, everything. Life. Where we're headed." I couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern. "Is something wrong, Sarah? You know you can talk to me." She paused, looking at a painting of two intertwined figures, the colors vibrant but chaotic. "I guess I'm just wondering if we're truly ready for everything that comes with this. You know, marriage, it's a lot. I think I've always been afraid of losing myself in it." My heart tightened. I reached out, taking her hand. "You don't have to lose yourself, Sarah. We're building this together. I'm not asking you to change or become something you're not. We're a team." She nodded, but the hesitation was still there. "It's just, I don't want to wake up one day and realize I've been trying to live up to some ideal of what I think we should be, instead of what we actually are." The weight of her words hung in the air, and I realized there was more to this than just a fleeting doubt. She wasn't just talking about us. She was talking about herself. "Do you feel like you've lost yourself?" I asked quietly, holding her gaze. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not yet, but I worry I could." We walked in silence for a few moments, the conversation lingering between us like a shadow. It wasn't the first time I'd seen Sarah wrestle with the idea of self-identity, but I didn't realize how deep it went. As we left the gallery, we were both quiet. I wanted to fix it, to reassure her, but part of me also understood that this wasn't something I could just solve. It was something we both had to figure out together. The following week, Sarah made an unexpected decision. She sat me down in our living room, her expression serious, and told me she was considering taking a break from her work as a designer to focus on something else, something she hadn't fully explored before. "I've been thinking about writing," she said, nervously twisting her fingers. "I've always loved it, but I've never given myself permission to do it. I've always been so focused on what I should be doing instead of what I actually want to do." I was taken aback. "You want to write?" She nodded. "I want to see where it could go. I don't know if it'll lead anywhere, but I need to try. For me." I could see the passion in her eyes, the excitement bubbling beneath the surface. This was important. She needed to do this. "I think it's amazing," I said, my voice sincere. "If this is something you want, you should go for it. I'll support you no matter what." Her relief was palpable, but there was still a trace of uncertainty. "I just don't want to be selfish. I don't want to put everything else on hold for something that might not even work out." I reached over and took her hand. "Sarah, I married you because I love all of you. Not just the parts of you that fit into what I think a perfect marriage should look like. I want you to chase what makes you happy. I'll be right here beside you, whatever happens." She smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you." The next few months were an exploration for Sarah. She signed up for a writing workshop, spent hours working on short stories, and even started a blog. I saw a new spark in her. The way she lit up when she talked about her writing, the way her eyes shone when she shared her progress with me. She was becoming herself again, in a way I hadn't realized she'd lost. But as Sarah began to find herself in her writing, I realized I was facing a shift of my own. I had always been the steady one, the one who kept things grounded, but I started to feel restless. I loved my job, but something was missing. I'd been so focused on supporting Sarah's dreams that I hadn't stopped to consider my own. One evening after dinner, I sat down with Sarah, a notebook open in front of me. "I've been thinking." I began, running my hand through my hair. I've been so caught up in trying to make everything work for us that I haven't really asked myself what I want to do next. Maybe I need to take a step back and figure that out. She turned to me, her eyes soft. You know I'll always support you, right? I know, I said, smiling. I just think I need to figure out what makes me tick. I've been stuck in this cycle of work, 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 and I'm starting to wonder if that's the only way to live. Sarah leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. You deserve to chase your own dreams too, Ethan. We both do. It was a simple truth, but one that hit me like a revelation. We had been so focused on each other's growth, so absorbed in our love story, that we had forgotten to prioritize our own individual journeys. It was time for both of us to grow, not just together, but separately. Over the next few months, I took some time to explore different opportunities. I enrolled in a business course to learn more about starting my own company, something I had always dreamed of but never fully committed to. It was a risky move, but it felt like the right one. I could see the potential in myself that I'd been overlooking for years. Meanwhile, Sarah's writing took off in ways neither of us expected. Her blog gained a following, and soon she was publishing short stories and receiving invitations to write for online magazines. Her confidence soared as her passion turned into a tangible career. It was inspiring to watch her bloom. We continued to grow, individually and together. Our marriage became something deeper, not just because we were supporting each other's dreams, but because we had allowed ourselves the space to be individuals within that commitment. And as the months went by, I realized that the twists and turns of our journey were exactly what we needed to make our love stronger. Not every chapter would be easy. In fact, some would be incredibly difficult. But we were no longer just surviving. We were thriving. Together, but also as our own people. As Sarah sat beside me one night, sharing her latest story ideas, I smiled. I think we're doing okay. She laughed, leaning her head on my shoulder. Yeah, I think we are. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that we were exactly where we were meant to be. Just when we thought our lives were finally settling into a rhythm of mutual support and growth, the universe had one last, unexpected twist for us. It was a quiet evening. Sarah and I sitting on the porch of our little house, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunset. We had just returned from a weekend getaway to celebrate the success of Sarah's writing and my latest business venture. Life was good. We were on a high. But the phone call shattered the peace. The ring of my phone cut through the calm, and I glanced at the screen. It was from a blocked number. Something in my gut told me this wasn't a typical call. Hello, I answered, my voice low. There was a pause before a familiar voice came through, one I hadn't heard in months. Ethan, it's me, Jake. I froze. My mind raced as I turned toward Sarah, who had also noticed the shift in my demeanor. Her eyes widened, sensing something was off. Jake? I repeated, my heart pounding. What do you want? I don't know how to say this, but I have something I need to confess. Jake's voice was urgent, shaky even. And it's about Sarah. I shot a glance at her. What is it? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause, the kind that made everything feel impossibly heavy. Finally, Jake spoke again. I've been keeping something from you both. Something that's been eating at me. The reason I left, it wasn't just because of Sarah. It wasn't because I thought I couldn't be what she needed. I could hear the desperation in his voice, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. It was because of her mom. My heart sank, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. Her mom? What does she have to do with anything? Jake hesitated before letting out a heavy sigh. I don't know how to say this, but I was in love with her. Sarah's mom. And I never told her. I never told anyone, not even Sarah. The world around me seemed to stop. I looked at Sarah, who had gone pale in the moonlight, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't process the words I had just heard. Wait, you were in love with Sarah's mom? I stammered, my mind reeling. Jake's voice cracked. I never acted on it. I couldn't. But when I saw how close you two were, how happy you made her, I couldn't handle it. It ate me alive. That's why I broke up with Sarah that day. And that's why I left without saying a word. I thought I was protecting her from the truth. But now I realize how much I hurt you both. I'm sorry. The silence on the other end was suffocating. I glanced at Sarah, who was visibly trembling. She was struggling to comprehend what I had just learned, her hands clasped tightly together. Jake, why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice strained. I don't know, he said, his voice small. I just needed to confess. I've been carrying this guilt around for so long. I thought maybe it would help to finally tell someone, but I don't know if it makes things better. Maybe it only makes everything worse. I stood up, pacing the porch, the weight of the revelation settling in. You don't get it, do you? I said sharply. You've done enough damage, Jake. This is a mess. The line went quiet, and then I heard a soft click as Jake hung up. I stared at my phone in disbelief, the screen almost glowing in the darkness. I looked back at Sarah, who was frozen, staring at the ground. Her face was a mask of shock, her mind trying to piece together the unimaginable truth that had just been laid bare. Sarah, I whispered, my voice fragile. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and empty. How could he? She trailed off, her voice shaking. How could he do this? To me? To my family? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head as if trying to erase the words she had just heard. I thought I had put everything behind me, but now it's like nothing makes sense anymore. My own mother, Jake, all of this. It's too much. I took a step toward her, my heart breaking for her, but she pulled away, standing up and pacing across the porch. I need time, Ethan, she said, her voice cracking. I need time to process this. I need to understand why Jake kept this from me. Why my mom... Her words trailed off as she walked to the railing, gripping it tightly. I wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but I could see the pain in her eyes. The hurt was so raw, so deep, that I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between us. This is a nightmare, she whispered, barely audible. I know, I said, my heart heavy. But we'll face